Welcome to Cast Friendship, where we sit down with awesome creators to talk about their awesome creations. My name is Shubham Mehta, and today I'm joined by Sin, one half of the duo behind Navathem's End, a kit bash system that fuses Powered by the Apocalypse, Forged in the Dark, and old school Renaissance, and is currently a successful Kickstarter that has matched its goal. But we're kind of hoping that it gets even further because there's some really cool stretch goals. Sid, welcome to the show.
Hi, hello, hi. My name is Sin. I am a tabletop RPG designer, game designer, layout artist, and illustrator. And I have been working on this game for a while, and it was initially kickstarted under Our Shores, which was a a Kickstarter that basically funded three big games and a zine full of micro games, micro RPGs, and that completed the digital version of, or well, the digital version and like I guess like the first kind of edition of Navathem's End, and we are currently working on um, a print run that will have the updated, that will also have an updated PDF and a companion book for Navathem End.
It's very exciting. I've had a chance to obviously read through the book, and I'm a fan. And so I have a bunch of questions about everything, to be honest. But let's start at the very beginning because that's a good place to start. Um, so when you was first starting out as a game designer, what was a task that was particularly challenging that now after having made a bunch of games and Navathem's End is not doesn't require the same effort anymore? What's something that's become, oh, like this is just part of the process, and back then you were like, wow, what is this challenge?
Uh, hmm. I When I first started Navathem, I didn't really know how to design for both uh, Powered by the Apocalypse and Forge in the Dark. I was more of an OSR and D&D type of person at the time. But the reason why I chose those two particular systems for Navathem was because I felt like a lot of my current skill set was no longer really uh, helping me create the stories that I wanted. So I buckled down and tried to figure out how exactly to design for those systems, and I was so bad at it. At first, I like had no idea how to make a compelling playbook. I had no idea how to make moves. I couldn't grasp the concept for a while. Um, and it was really Pam that when Pam eventually came on and joined the team, well, team is just two people. But you know what I mean? When Pam eventually came on, because I invited her to come help me, that was when I really kind of like got to watch her make the moves and like make some like suggestions to the playbooks, and I was like, oh, because I'm really more of a learn by doing kind of person.
Mm, mhm.
So uh to watch her kind of like theorize and craft some moves and stuff in front of me was super helpful and kind of helped me ease into the system. And of course, like Blades in the Dark is her wheelhouse.
Mm.
So at that point, I had only really played like a few games under that system, a few sessions. So I wasn't quite like I knew there were parts of it that I wanted, but I didn't know how exactly the full system kind of like gelled together. You know what I mean?
Mm.
So like just having her around to voice out like I kind of want this, but I don't know how to execute it was super helpful because then I was no longer just like designing in my head.
Mm.
I finally had like a partner to
Mm.
kind of listen and tell me, oh, that's a little odd, or oh, maybe we should do it this way or like that way, or yeah, that sounds like great because like affirmation is also like a good thing. But yeah, uh, I used to be super bad at these systems, and now it's like I feel like I can create a PBTA like quick game in like a day or two or something.
That's amazing, and I think that just goes to show that there's just so many different ways to pick up something like this. Like you said, it's a lot of learn by doing, but also having someone to work with. Um, and then next thing you know, you're creating for a completely different system from what you're familiar with. Um,
Mhm.
with In terms of collaboration, that actually brings up an interesting problem. So, or question rather. Usually, when we look at a lot of creative projects, there's a project lead or a creative lead who kind of is the final arbiter on where the whole project is going, right? What it is trying to achieve and stuff like that. But then when you go into, like you said, a collaboration and it's just two people, it's a different conversation, right? It's not just a top down kind of way of acting. So, how did you two kind of balance responsibilities and also resolve disagreements? Because I imagine that's a different challenge.
Mhm. I didn't really have any disagreements, if I'm being honest. And also we lived together at that point, so it was really easy to just kind of be like, when you're having not necessarily shower thoughts, but kind of like that. You're kind of like
Mhm.
sitting down and you're not even really working, and all of a sudden the idea comes to you, but you're kind of thinking, is this too far fetched? It's so
Mhm.
easy to just be like, hey, so about this thing. It was pretty nice to just kind of have that. I In terms of like collaboration or something like that, it was pretty easy because we had already collaborated on other things before. The first game that Pam and I had ever collaborated on is a duet game, Across This Wasteland with You, and
Mhm.
it's a map it's kind of like a landscape map building game where you play as like two queer lovers out like traversing a desert, that kind of thing. Um, and that was our first collab, and then we have like another collab of my big aswang wedding, which is it highlights like the all the drama of like Filipino weddings, and in the skin of like what if you were all monsters or something like that. And we have another one, which is public utility jeepneys, where you play as the downtrodden drivers of transforming jeepneys
Mhm.
in the setting of like bureaucratic Philippines or something like that. So it kind of came super easy and natural to the both of us.
Mhm.
We didn't necessarily have uh, arguments, I think, because her initial role actually was to edit me,
Mhm.
because I had written almost everything at that point.
Mhm.
But eventually I asked her to be like, would you like to design as well?
Mhm.
Because I feel like I am hitting a personal limitation. I was hitting that personal limitation of like I need different perspective at this point
Mhm.
on the text, because uh I feel like there's an oomph that's missing,
Mhm.
and she definitely brought the oomph. So there you go.
Nice. I mean, I think that's so important to have that ability to just self-reflect on where you might be stumbling and then where to ask for help. Because often, I think as creators, we kind of get in our own heads and worry that
For
asking for
sure.
anything, it's like, oh no, I got to figure it out. I got to figure it out. And then, in fact, that's what stops you from figuring it out. Um,
Yeah, yeah. Hmm.
So, having worked on so many games, including the ones that you'd worked on with Pam before, and then Navathem's End, what are some things that you learned along the way that you brought back for the project when it's now for its Kickstarter, for its publication Kickstarter? What were some of the like? Oh, that's a thing we picked up. Let's bring it back over here.
Mm, Navathem's End has a design that's very character centric. Uh, there's so many ways to build an agent. You start from like their background, so you choose that, and then there's several different iterations that you can have just based on like tower bonds and hubris bonds, and then of course there's the different playbooks and stuff like that. And I think it really has been kind of a merging of a lot of the things that I've also built in the past. I do have a lot of very character centric games. Because I don't know, that's just like how I build. When I first built uh Navathem, it literally started out as a character sheet because I was like, I don't know where this game is going or what it even is. Here's a character sheet, let's figure it out. That was like the first ever proper playtest, and I think that that kind of like, I feel like I'm not really ever gonna move away from that sort of thing of like building a character first and then seeing how to build the rest
Mm,
eventually. Because like in the end, right, it's the player's needs that you're trying to address with all of the mechanics in the game. Like how does the character do X, Y, and Z, which is the entire thing. And so like I feel like Navathem is just like a mature version of a lot of the other stuff that I've put out in a way.
I definitely relate with the idea of the character is at the core of it all, and Anthem really does showcase that because, like you said, the tower bonds and the hubris bonds, and I'm a big fan of the tower bonds and the whole system around building like your character's personal relationships with people in the tower. It's just when I was creating my own character for it, I suddenly felt so invested in the world and seeing that character's journey, and I'm still at session zero, right, which is a unique experience. I think that's a lovely mechanic. So I guess the next question then becomes: I know you and Pam are big fans of creating fan content, and I'm wondering if things like creating that kind of carried over to your approach to Navathem's End, which also kit bashes a bunch of systems. Was it the sense of like, I'm a fan of this, let's play with it, and if so, how did that end up influencing you?
um, well, I can't speak for Pam because
Mhm.
Pam
Right.
has draws a lot from a lot of things. But lore wise, the world of Navathem was heavily inspired by the Edge Chronicles.
Mhm.
This is a multi book series by Paul Stewart and Chris Riddle, and it unfortunately doesn't sell in the Philippines anymore. I'm so sad I can't get copies anymore. But it all started when like my stepbrother brought back a copy of like the first book, and I was just like super captured by the world. And it's so simple the way it starts. It starts with like the main character getting lost in the woods, and the entire setting is that it is a city on the edge of a cliff, and that's it. Like that's all you know. Um, Beyond the cliff is forest. These like something called the deep wood, and I was just really captured by that kind of world building. That like, you don't really know what's beyond. You only have yourself,
Mhm.
and a lot of like the lore stuff all through it really enchanted me, and I read the rest of the books when it was still available here in the
Mhm.
country.
Mhm.
um I was just so enamored. I love it. Like it has everything from like sky pirates to like librarians that like bring back tomes long gone and stuff
Mhm.
like that. If you read the full thing,
Mhm.
honestly, you will see a lot of parallels all throughout like Navatham because I really really love the place. I love the book. I love everything.
Mhm.
When it comes to mechanics, um, I really like Powered by the Apocalypse. I really enjoyed like my first two sessions of PBTA, and I after following the bakers on Twitter and seeing how genuinely good people they are, and like their how interesting their views are on design. I was kind of super captured. I was really just like, I want to design for this, and the feeling of being able to lean more into archetypes and stuff in playbooks instead of, I guess, what more like, I guess, like what most people are used to, which is like the D&D archetypes and stuff
Mm,
like that,
mm,
kind of really also was something that I enjoyed. I like the idea of like in Navathem, right? Like you can be a command
mm,
which has a lot of like skills that are very much like, this is how I enhance my fellow teammates. But does that necessarily mean you are like how would you scale that out like in D&D, right? Like you build a high charisma character or something like that, and I feel like that's not necessarily something that you have to think about
mm,
in PBTA, which I
mhm,
find super cool
mhm,
because it's something completely different from what I was used to.
mhm,
So it was kind of like, oh, I you can you can lean into archetypes, but you also don't have to be beholden to them,
uh-huh,
which I super enjoyed. I mean, and like I'm not saying that like PBTA is better than like D&D design and vice versa. Like
mm,
that's not at all what I think I that's not at all my point. But like I just liked the sense of liberty that I had when designing for PBTA, because I guess like my first perspective of it was that it was a toolkit and less of a, it has to absolutely like it for me it was less of a, this is a full system
mm,
engine that you have to put in the game that you're designing
mm,
or else it won't work. I took it more as, this is a box of tools
mm,
that you can build something with, and that's kind of how it came to be. Because if you notice, I don't necessarily use all of like, I guess, traditional PPTA
mm.
stuff in the entirety of Navathem. Like I kind
Yeah,
of mix it up with other things. So
yeah.
yeah.
No, definitely, and I love the metaphor of a toolbox, right? Because I think that's often what you learn and develop as a creator is just a variety of tools, and then you find the right one for the task you're trying to accomplish. And for example, if you do want to create a very character centric game, it makes sense to use a variety of these set of tools as opposed to something that might fix you into a particular direction very quickly. Um,
Hmm.
so that completely makes sense. I was just wondering, because something interesting that happens in Navathem's end is that the ability to use and wield magic is limited to mages who are largely kind of absent in the world. The lore wise, they're not very common, and even the playbook is a kind of a secondary thing that you can stack on top of an existing playbook. So I was just wondering, A, was there any concern that magic, which is often a very big draw of fantasy TTRPGs, um, not including that as a core thing would alienate people? And also, did it create restrictions within like the ability to design that, okay, this can't be around magic and it's a fantasy world at the same time?
Um. Hmm. I don't think I thought about it in a sense of like, oh, uh, perhaps people will play it less because there's no like direct like magic or something. Because magic does exist in Navathem, but it's limited, uh, which is very true. But I felt like that like the hope was that it would create tension instead,
Mm,
where okay, this is what we have to work with. How do we then resolve it without, you know, just doing prestidigitation and like
yeah.
letting it happen. And I think this is where kind of like the blades stuff came in, because blades in the dark like Duskwall doesn't really have, it isn't really a high magic setting either, and I was kind of into that sort of idea where there's magic, but only in certain spots, only in certain ways, only
mm,
through certain mediums. And when I first created Navathem, anyway, like even just lore, like before mechanics were ever involved, um, that was really already a thing that like magic is not like the strongest thing in this world, and specifically because of a historical, communally tragic and
mm.
traumatizing event.
Right.
So like I felt like the hope was that it would put forward a different kind of tension,
Mm,
because now you're living in a world where they are perhaps scared of magic in the sense of like uh because the general theory in like lore wise in Nevathem's end is that magic comes from chaos now.
mm, mm,
That's why it's all like chaos magic sources, telechaotic, biochaotic, etc.
mhm,
And the idea of that further is that mages can wield the chaos, but that
mhm,
doesn't necessarily mean that it'll always come out the way that they want it to.
mm,
Things could go awry. And
mm,
so people are terrified of the idea of like mages either fucking up and making some colossal mistake, or like wreaking havoc upon the world, which is what one mage did at some
mhm,
point in the timeline, where in this mage created the mockingbird that could grant wishes
mm,
and ended up wishing colossals into existence. So it's that sort of thing where magic is not necessarily a good or bad thing. It is in how you wield it. And so I just kind of had to make mechanics around that. It did have a few different iterations across like the different playtests, because I was like I wasn't really sure what would be most fun.
mhm,
Um, the very first one I think was point buy, because I do like point buy
mm,
systems. I am quite like taken by point buy systems. I like
mhm,
the idea of like as you can see from the different XP
mhm.
ways to do
Yeah,
stuff,
yeah,
right? uh I was thinking that like you could earn particular mage XP every time you do this or that or something like that, and then you would have to buy your skills through that. But I felt like it was too tedious. There's like already a lot of things to take note of after and before every session. So after a few more like different like iterations, because I was like maybe I should categorize the skills according to this or that, like all of those things, right? And then eventually I was just like, you know what, I'll have them just open to like have everything open to the mages, but they're limited by their mage points with it, which they have to roll every dawn,
mhm,
which I felt was the smoothest that we ever got to, because then my characters would I'd only kind of like during the playtest I just remind them, by the way, roll your mage points, and that's it. That's all the bookkeeping they have to do, and I'm like, oh thank God,
yeah.
this is good.
I really like. I'm very fascinated by the whole part about playtesting because um, it's a lot like a beta reading when you write something, right? And then seeing how the story is being perceived. So, what was the editing process for this? You said that Pam at some point was initially just helping with editing, and then but there was also playtest. So, what's the process for iterating on this thing, and how many iterations did Navathan then go through?
um that was publicly released, technically just one,
Mhm,
but to my playtesters, oh, we had a lot of patches. So I made like a Discord special for like all of my playtesters, and we have a particular channel in there that's like patch notes.
mhm,
So every so often, like every couple of sessions, I would have that updated. I'd like upload a new version and whatnot. So it was always changing really for a while. For the entirety, I think of like a year and a half,
mhm.
I was always dropping patch notes.
Right.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. In terms of editing, I think it was when the book was like 90% complete, where I was like, "Hey Pam, here you go. Can
Right.
you like, uh, can you edit me?" And so that was how it started, really. So like during the entire patch notes thing, like Pam wasn't necessarily editing me. We were just kind of like putting words down and like putting mechanics down and testing them. And then when it was kind of like the play tests were kind of winding down, we're like, okay, we're kind of more or less, this is the most comfy
Mm,
iteration of the rules so far. Let's start writing things down
mm,
properly. And then the editing came around.
right.
So it bled, of course. Like it was bleeding red when it first came back to me, because I am learning that I am that type of game designer. I don't have any problems with it, by the way. I'm fine with being edited. Like
Mm,
it's pretty normal to me, especially considering my like educational background, where I took my degree is in research,
mm,
so there's a lot of editing.
right.
And there's a lot of like bleeding of pages. Like the first Navathem draft came back to me like absolutely bleeding red, and I was like, okay, all right, let's go.
Yeah. It's gonna be well. Cool. Get the coffee. Get going. No, makes sense. But I think, I think coming to terms with that part is actually really important because editing's a good thing, right? Like, I don't know. I think I had one of our colleagues was like, editing is a form of showing love because you clearly care enough to interact and really think about what's being said, and then you
Yep.
want to see it presented in the best way possible. So, um, yeah, I think editors are super valuable, and I get where you're coming from, and it's great. So when all this playtesting was going on and you were patching and testing it out with players, were there moments where your players surprised you with their use of the rules where you were like, oh, I did not see that being how this works out, but interesting and that's cool. And were there um, moments where basically, yeah, where you were surprised by how the rules worked out or the game worked out and it wasn't an intended consequence?
I think a lot of that came when combat started coming into question.
Right.
Um, how do I describe it? So this was a happy accident, kind of. At some point, we were testing out combat and we were testing out how it works and whatnot. I still hadn't figured out how exactly to do initiative or whatever. At some point, when I asked them for feedback, I was like, "How does this feel right now? What's up?" They said that the most fun part of combat is the feeling of how Navathem suddenly turns into a resource management game. And I
Mm,
was like, oh, that was not my intention at all.
mm, mm,
But I kind of get why that was what came out. So just to like explain briefly, combat. Well, there is a few systems in place to make combat happen. First of all, we have harm and loadout, uh, armor points, and how this works is basically depending on your loadout, whether it's subtle, heavy, or I forget the middle, something like that. Sorry,
good. I'm
I'm
blanking.
warning you. I'm blanking on it, but like
Yeah.
there's three,
Yeah.
and you get certain armor points for each type,
Mm,
and armor points are used to deflect harm
yeah.
points, and harm has like stages
Mhm,
where if you're unable to deflect it, you get like a level of harm, a second level of harm, etc. And these levels of harm stack.
mm,
So, what do these levels of harm mean? They
mm,
have different effects on you. Like the first one is that you kind of roll at disadvantage, and
mhm,
then eventually, like it gets worse and worse and worse until it's
mm,
all fully stacked, and you can barely really do anything.
yeah.
Um, and the only way to clear those stacks is if a medic is with you.
Mm,
because the medics have skills that either deflect
mhm,
um, harm from coming in, either they prevent it or like they can remove it while the game is while the combat thing is happening. So um, I intentionally made it a limited like healing. I intentionally made it limited to kind of like add to the tension of the scenario. So then I didn't quite realize that this would lend towards a lot of resource management of players figuring out, okay, how best do I use my armor points?
mhm,
What skills do I take so that my armor points don't drain so fast, or so that I can recover armor points, or etc. Because there are a few moves here and there that can do that. And how then do I blend that with like conflict moves so that I'm able to directly attack the enemy as best as I can. So now when it comes to attacking enemies, how we did that in Navathem's End is uh, we have a building adversary system
mhm,
where you build enemies by create like putting tags on them. So like this enemy could have ballistics in
mhm,
that every time it attacks, it is a splash damage of
mhm.
like two harm to all agents nearby, that kind of thing, right?
Right.
And then you could combo that with another thing, with like blight, for example, which will add another point of harm every time an agent takes damage, etc., etc.
Mm,
So it becomes this tension between how do we handle an adversary
mhm,
with these tags, and how do I juggle my armor
mhm,
while also deciding what do I do so that this thing I'm fighting goes down faster.
mm,
Because there are in across like scattered skills and stuff, there are ways to remove tags.
mhm,
And like as a GM, you could also say that like, oh yeah, sure, maybe that move will warrant
mhm,
removal of this tag, and you could also reduce the number of rounds that the adversary stays on the board, because that's one of the things. It's adversaries don't have HP; they
mhm,
have a tag of the number of rounds that they stay. So, like, even if, for example, your agent
mhm,
does like a bunch of damage or something, if it still has like 5 rounds on its tag, it's gonna stay for 5 more rounds, and then like it kind of like lowers eventually. So
mhm,
like technically all enemies will die eventually, but
mhm,
then like it's all about resource management. Like how long can either like how long can you last,
mhm,
or what do you do to make those monsters go away faster.
mm.
Uh, and it kind of turned into a fun resource management game for my players, and I was oh right. Yeah, that was intentional. That was, that was what I wanted all along. That was
I am a
fun.
genius, and this was planned. Um, I see where
uh,
you're coming from. So we've talked a lot about the mechanics, and I'm very fascinated by them, but also really fascinated by the world building because, like you said, it's inspired by the Edge Chronicles, but I think it also manages to find a fine balance between being there and useful for the players, but also not overwhelming them with too much information. Um, how did you find that balance? What was the process for how much world building there's going to be, and how much of it is going to be left for the players to figure out?
uh, hmm. Um. Well, at the very beginning, you kind of help build out the general environment of of the players. Um. You do it by building your tower. You do it by creating like the important NPCs in that tower, and etc. etc. And like after that, you can kind of like build as you go, ideally. But throughout like the book, also we have a lot of interspersed things of like this is how this thing works in Anthem, but you could also change it up if you want to. We have very very loose guidelines for lore. If anything, we just have a few things that we like put in there for like GMs to work with. But in terms of like um you have to read all of this stuff to
Mm,
kind of figure it out. I don't think it was necessarily, or I hope so. I hope that wasn't like necessarily the impression. Because it beyond it being a kit bash system, the
mm,
hope was that it would be kind of like a sandbox campaign with some tools, with some toys in there already.
mm,
So you have the three major cities,
mm,
but there's so many other names on the map, and like you can build anywhere. You can build your tower anywhere technically.
mm,
So you don't have to be stationed within a city.
mm.
You don't have to be stationed within like a town even. You could just like be a tower out there, stuff like that. You know. The hope is that it's interesting and engaging and approachable enough, um, so that like whenever they read stuff, they go like, oh cool, so like how would it work in my table, kind of.
Mhm.
That's how we wanted to have it, I think again.
Okay, so I know that Navathem's End is your child, so you must love all of it. But I'm wondering if there's a mechanic in particular in the game that you're a big fan of, that you just were pretty chuffed to have figured out or gotten it to work in the game.
Oh, okay. Let me think about this.
Sure,
A mechanic that just kind of worked out.
or that you're a big fan
I
of. You're like, oh, that's neat.
think it really was the combat system.
Yeah.
'Cause I'm not good at building combat. I don't think like I don't have a lot of combat games. Like technically, my only quote unquote combat game was like my plants
Hmm.
games, and uh, my plants games is like super duper simple in that you don't really have to think about it. Um, but I think like when I was trying to think really hard about what I would want in terms of like how much should a GM prep for combat? How much should players feel stressed when they're fighting things? Um, I think after finally stumbling like so much over combat, because it really took I think a few months to figure this out. Prior to the system, I was really just kind of like making people roll and vibing with it. It's like let's just figure it out. And then when it finally clicked, when it finally just kind of like happened, and we had our first few combat sessions with that system,
Mhm.
all of us kind of just was like, "This is not bad, actually."
Nice.
So that that personally is still my. I don't know how that worked out, but it did kind of
Mm.
moment. Um, I'm pretty sure there's been another system that did this. I don't know what it is.
Mm. I
Like
mean,
I
yeah.
can't say I'm inspired by anything because I don't really know if any other system
Mhm.
uses this sort of like thing, but uh it works and it's very OSR, but it works.
I mean, I think that's again what's great is that because he's able to kit bash such different systems and make it work, it lands up being a very unique experience. Um, I'm curious. So you've spoken about the other games that you created, and I noticed that a lot of them also were specifically about, or rather, set in the Philippines, with the ones that you created with Pam, right? Um, and I often feel like when it comes to game create or any kind of creation, it's our personal experiences that dictate what makes the game unique, right?
Mhm.
And I don't think they're necessarily cultural experiences, but just personal experiences. I'm wondering what you think your personal experiences informed about Navathem's End. What was something that kind of do you think that I came from you and your personal experience that changed the direct or shaped the form of Navathem's and the way it is?
Mm. Um, hmm. During the early promotions of Navathem, before this Kickstarter, when it was still on like our shores and even before that, um, I I kept getting asked a lot why Navathem didn't seem overtly Filipino.
Mm,
Like it's not your your game that has like the usual things of like the babaylan or like the mandirigma or the bakunawa or
mm,
like whatever other things, right? And um how do I word this? My I I used to struggle with that,
mm,
eh, like that kind of angst in that because Navathan didn't really pick up or well it's I don't think it still has. Like I feel like I still have to really kind of like yell at people's faces for people to recognize and like kind of pick
mm,
up Navathan, right? So I did struggle a little bit with that angst of feeling like if I made Navathem more overtly like Filipino or something like that, would people have bought into it more? Um, would people really kind of like patronize it more or something like that? Because then it'd be like a cultural thing, right?
mm,
Like it'd be me showing off uh what things I know about my heritage and whatnot. But um it took a lot for me to eventually kind of accept and say that Navathem is Filipino because I am.
mm,
Just because it looks like if to a person it looks like a generic white fantasy, then that is what they are looking. That those are the glasses that they are using to look at Navathem's end.
mm,
Because if you look at it, I think personally, um, the different like cities, the world in itself, the different festivals, the how like love and polyamory and stuff works across the continents. Um, I wouldn't call it. I wouldn't flavor it as just like a generic fantasy. I think. I hope not. And if if that's the fantasy you want to play out with Navathan,
mm,
then that's what you see.
mm,
But in all of my games that I ran it for, there's always that touch of home,
mm,
of being misfits in a city that doesn't love you,
mm,
which is very Manila.
mm,
Of struggling for space, of things that go bump in the night while you're also struggling to make rent. It's I feel like the world becomes more vibrant if you look at it from the lens of somebody who's experienced those lived stories, I guess,
mm,
that lived in history. And yeah, it took me a bit to honestly kind of like be okay with that because um and this is like no shade to like other Filipino designers. I did initially release Navathems and alongside a lot of other like Filipino creators who were making very overtly Filipino things. And like I have those too, but like Navathem was not that.
mm,
And I was kind of like in that weird space of like everybody else was expecting me to also do something like that, because it looked like a trend. But like, this is why this space has issues, because they look at one popular thing coming out of a region and think that that's all that is there, which is
Yeah,
not true,
yeah,
right? Like, the point of a communal space like what we have in the tabletop RPG scene
mm,
is that stories can come from everywhere, and therefore all sorts of stories can come from everywhere too.
mhm,
And it can be every flavor that you want it to be, and everybody gets to have a seat at the table.
mhm.
That's the whole point. And like, I don't know, it took me a while. It took me a while to get there, but I got there
I
eventually.
I that resonates so much with me because definitely, even as just someone from India, anytime I create something, but even if it's not a game, just a story, there is this question of, especially if I'm putting it out, like, oh, is this
Is it X
Indian?
enough?
Yeah, and I've actually had this question asked to me. It's like, oh, I know we are submitting something for the Season Dragons, but my game's not necessarily very Indian, and I've often come to the same answer as you, is that you have to be Indian to make something Indian, and that's it. Your the facade, or rather the iconography, just because you have like, um say, I guess the stereotypical stuff, right, like Bollywood or music or whatever, it doesn't make it, that's not the only thing that makes it Indian. It can be just your
Mhm.
experience that's making the story. And in fact, it doesn't have to be. That's the other thing, I guess, is that as people of color, I think often the pressure becomes that you need to be a representation of the heritage that you come from, and you can't
Yeah.
just be a representation of the stories you want to tell, like whether they are or not informed by your heritage, right? Like, uh,
Uh-huh.
it often feels like we have to carry um, our as we call it, tags
Hmm.
along with us, instead of just creating, which is, yeah, it can get really tiring, because, or you get that angst of like, is this
Yeah.
enough? So that, no,
Yeah.
that really resonates. Yeah,
And like, as a Filipino, or as a person, I am also multiple other things other than being Filipino.
yeah,
I am a queer person. I am trans. I am um probably neurodivergent, apparently. I'm getting a diagnosis soon. That's nice. But anyway, you are multiple shades of multiple things as
yeah.
a person, and therefore all of those things will come out. And
Mm,
sometimes this or that will come out stronger than others. And like, um, people have asked me like, why isn't it overtly Filipino? Like, would you please look at the list of everybody who's worked on the book, because like every single person here is either Filipino or POC.
mm. Yeah,
And like the art, I hope like translates to it too. Like all of those things. And I just,
I
um, yeah, we are all very different, several shades of many things.
mm,
You know, and we shouldn't feel pressured to only display one thing or two. I
yeah.
think.
I think, especially when it comes to creating something that's like a fantasy world, right? It seems so odd to then segregate the world into, well, this is Filipino and this is Indian and then this is like European, and they're all going to be separate worlds in this fantasy world. Well, you're a fantasy world. You don't
Stupid.
need,
Yeah.
yeah. In fact, and
You Everything mixes. You know what I
yeah,
mean?
exactly. And I even just looking at two things that come to mind. One is, it's weird because I think, when you look at what we call Western fantasy, so much of it is just an amalgamation of various different European cultures, right? It's not like Western fantasy is just British or just American or just Nordic. It's Greek, Roman, all of it bashed together in some form. At least a lot of modern stuff is. So no one goes, oh, this doesn't feel Roman enough. They're like, yeah,
Yeah,
it's Western.
exactly.
But then
Exactly.
the moment anything comes from South Asia or Southeast Asia, they're like, oh, but this doesn't feel Indian enough. And you're like,
Yeah.
why does it
Yeah.
have
No,
to?
nobody. Nobody ever says this isn't like Western enough.
Yeah, it's such an odd pressure to have. And then regarding your question mention about the art in Navathem's End, I really liked it because when I was going through it, it's there's so many different people that are represented in those books, in those character arts. And I was commenting on this when I was having my conversation with Chirag as well, that it in fact, if there was anything that told me that this was made by a person of color, is the fact that the representation in the books itself and the world design feels so inclusive. Um, and that's kind of the big giveaway for me that, oh, this is something that's created by someone else. Because when I read a lot of purely Western kind of content created, especially by just purely only white creators, um, this is a common trend, but not always the case. It often feels exclusive, like it's, oh, it's this world, it's like this,
Right.
and these are the people here, and there's no variations
There's
on
no
that.
room for other things. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
and then you come here and you're like, oh, look, this, and like for example, I noticed one character was wearing a hijab, um
Yeah.
but there's no specific law reason for it to do it. It's just that
Yeah.
they're wearing it, and I love that because, yeah, you go create your own reason for them to have that,
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
so I get where you're coming from, and I personally really appreciate that kind of mold. Um, so yeah, that was just me kind of fanboying for a bit, but
Thank you. I yeah. This game has been quite the journey because it has it really has kind of. I tried really hard throughout the entire process to kill my darlings, to kind of not be too precious about it. And there's so much more of it, honestly, that did not make it to the final book simply because I felt like that's not really something that the players or the GMs are gonna need. You know what I mean? Like that's extra lore, that's campaign stuff. And that's not even like public campaign stuff. That's only if I want to run it, that kind of thing. And it's not because it's dodgy material or anything of that sort. It's really just like it's not stuff that's useful. You know what I mean? You
Mhm.
have to
Yeah.
pare things down sometimes. And also you have to kind of also create like kind of a standard for yourself that because this is now him, this is what I want for it. And I still have many dreams for this game. There are times when I feel like I've put all of my eggs in this Navathan basket,
Mm,
and I don't know if any of them are gonna hatch.
mm,
But it is heartwarming to see a lot of people backing it, to see a lot of people kind of like saying, "Hey, this is cool," that kind of thing. And that kind of feedback is more than what I guess I was initially
mhm.
ever expecting. Especially since um, I have a lot of dreams for Nevathim, right? But you're never really sure if any of them are gonna manifest. You're
Yeah.
never really sure if any of them are gonna come true. And like one of the things that like I want to do is like submit it to awards, uh, do another print run, uh, do more things. I really want to do like a lot with this thing, but a part of it is also like when do you let go?
Yeah.
Like when do you let go and move on to like the next thing that you're writing? And I do have a thing that I'm kind of been low key staring at. It's the only thing it has right now is like opening an opening paragraph,
Yeah.
but it's that sort of thing of like, oh man, I want to be able to work on this thing now. I want to. I don't. It's not necessarily like closing the chapter on Avathim, right? But I want to let it kind of just be on its own and let it kind of like whew, so that it could become something else in other people's hands. But I also worry that it's not quite there yet. You know what I mean? It's not at the point where people will pick it up and just kind of do whatever they want with it yet. And I wanted to get there.
Mm,
So I'm still kind of like holding its hand, like what you said, like a baby. I'm
mhm.
still kind of holding its hand, hoping that it'll get there so that I can eventually let it go
Yeah.
and be like, I can create other things. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a tricky one. I think finding that point is, it's that thing of the story's never over. It's just kind of you have to. That's a famous saying, right? Like a story's never done. You just give up on it at some point because you kind of have to move on. Yeah, it's that thing. And I imagine you'll probably come back a few years from now and be like, well, now I've learned all these other tools, and now it seems like a good time to reiterate this. So there's always that possibility. But you said you have a paragraph written. Yeah, what are some other ideas or any projects that you're excited for that you're working on? You want to shout out?
Well, uh, I am writing something that I um how do I explain it? So the idea is that um the world is a barren wasteland.
Lovely.
And all that's left is these walking, moving domes, like biomes,
Uh-huh.
um, where this is basically like the last bastion of humanity, right? And there can be multiple of those, but basically all of humanity is contained within these moving things.
Uh-huh.
And um, the idea is that you, as a character and player in this world, you are meant to go out of the biomes and into the ruined world to take things back. And you're all crafters. So you're all the working title is artificer.
Uh-huh.
So you're all artificers, and you are guided by the a spirit of the machine. And like these spirits are kind of like spirits of lightning, spirits of fire, or
Uh-huh.
something like that. So I'm like kind of like pulling out from like the Navathem magic system a little bit and kind of like putting it here. And the whole idea is that you can create things. So it's gonna be a kind of like a phase game that's also, it might start feeling more like a board game, honestly, because there will be a phase to the game where the community, the biome, has to lock down because there's this thing called like a night storm,
Uh-huh.
where it just kind of like comes by and wrecks things. So that's why the world is like broken, because there's this roaming storm for miles and miles and miles
Yeah.
that just destroys everything in its path. And when it passes the biomes, it also kind of like wrecks some of the systems.
Uh-huh.
So the whole point is to go out, scavenge, return, craft something, build it for the biome, buckle down. So that's the kind of like the game loop that I'm working on and don't know how to execute it yet. But that's kind of the idea.
Uh-huh.
Um, yeah, it's super vague. I have a few things written down.
Uh-huh.
Um, I have like no idea what the lore is going to be, like
Uh-huh.
why the storm thing happened, how the spirits of the machine work,
Uh-huh.
how things are, what
Uh-huh.
kind of stuff is out there. But I just really wanted to create like a crafting game.
Right. Right.
Just really wanted to create a craft. I really love crafting
Uh-huh.
in like games and stuff.
Uh-huh.
And I don't know a lot of tabletop games that have crafting at its like
Yeah.
core mechanic,
Yeah. Yeah.
and like its core draw. And I
Yeah.
really love the idea of you all being like artificers. You're
Uh-huh.
all fucking crafting nerds,
Yeah.
and you're just different shades of crafting nerds.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's the idea. That's like the big idea right now, and it's right there. I want to work on it. But like Navathan still has to kind of like be
Yeah.
pushed around and like
Uh,
presented, and hopefully, like I'm hitting a point where I'm like, what do I have to do for people to
yeah.
to notice this darn game? Just like pick it up so I can let it go.
Oof. Yeah, I know that feeling. That's a tough one. But I think I just to put a pin in this, I do think Navathem's also just looking at like the Kickstarter, it's come a long way because I'd heard about it before. Um, when I first came across you and Pam, and I was like, okay, cool, this is a game, and I'm planning on playing it. And since then, I think its popularity has also grown up. But also, I, with creation, popularity is such an fleeting thing. It's there in someone's mind,
I
and then
know,
it's gone the
yeah.
next
And then
day.
it's gone.
Yeah, but I think the fact that it's become this full-fledged creation in itself is a big milestone that you should probably just like acknowledge, like, because I don't know, but if I finally get around to finishing some of the publications that I have in mind, I know that the moment I do it, I'll be like, why isn't this thing happened, like, why isn't it big now? But at
Uh-huh.
the same time, right now that would be good enough, right, just to get there. So it's that thing of shifting goalposts. And I know as creators we always chasing the next goalpost, but like now them, I would say it's a pretty cool thing, and you should definitely be proud of what you created.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, that's everything from me. Is there anything else you want to just mention before we wrap this up?
So yeah, this was co-created between myself and my partner, the Dove Taylor. So please do follow them also. They're working on a lot of cool stuff, and I I don't know how you're gonna do this, but I would also like to shout out all of the artists that worked on the initial book. We are still gonna be using the same art for like the revisions and the revised layout and stuff. So that's super exciting. I really love the art that was created for Navathem, and I don't, I can't imagine it with like other with a different kind of like treatment. Um, what else? I don't know. Just like we have a website, navathemrpg.com.
Amazing, amazing.
uh, buy the game.
Yes, do it. Go back to Kickstarter or buy the game. Both. Amazing. I will be throwing up all the credits and important stuff in the links in the description, but also I'll try to show it in the video itself. Sid, thank you so much for joining us for this
Thank
conversation.
you for having me.
It's been a pleasure. Everybody, goodbye. We'll see you next week, hopefully. Take care.